I'm Mark Golub. Welcome to a JBS special presentation of Election 2020. We'll be looking at issues of importance to the pro-Israel American Jewish community as we try to give you some information and perspective that may aid you in your vote this November. And I'm so pleased to be joined by two individuals who hold very different views, but who share a passion for America and Jewish life. It's a pleasure to welcome back to JBS Halie Soifer, Executive Director of the Jewish Democratic Council of America, the JDCA. Prior to her heading the JDCA, Halie worked for 4 different members of Congress, including Senators Kamala Harris and Chris Coons. And in the 2008 presidential election, Halie worked on the Obama presidential campaign as the Florida Jewish Vote Director. Halie then went on to serve as Senior Policy Advisor in the Obama administration. And it's also a pleasure to welcome back to JBS Bruce Abramson, a principal at the JBB&A Strategist and B2 Strategist, and a senior fellow and director of the nonprofit ASEC Fund, and he's the author of American Restoration: Winning America's Second Civil War. Bruce has spent nearly 4 decades writing in depth on American Jewry and on politics, and on Israel's place on the world stage. And Bruce worked with the 2016 Republican Platform Committee to draft its pro-Israel plank. And I thank both of you for joining me. It is a pleasure to have both of you with us. Thank you for making time to join us on JBS.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, so I want to just say in general, American Jews understand that traditionally 70% or more of American Jewry has traditionally voted Democratic. And there's little question that that is going to be true in the November 2020 election. We'll see, to be sure, but at the moment, that's the expectation. At the same time, there is a large group of Jews whose overriding concern tends to be the well-being of the state of Israel, and not just in an ideal way, but it's the people of Israel. There are 6 million Jews now living in Israel, and American Jews care about how American foreign policy will impact those 6 million Jews. So at the moment, while many American Jewish Democrats feel that the Democratic Party is ideologically more comfortable to them, for them, that it represents more of their values in terms of the place that they see caring for the underclass, and in some way establishing a government that is more responsive to climate change and the environmental needs. And there are also people in the Democratic Party, and American Jews are among these, who just think Donald Trump is a disaster as a person. And they loathe him, they hate him, and they will call him a racist, they will call him a bigot, they'll call him a Nazi, they'll say he is a white supremacist, they'll say he's a Russian agent, and that they feel that he in no way represents what an American president should be, and that he's a threat to democracy and a threat to the future of the United States. Conversely, there are Jews who are pro-Israel, who look at what Donald Trump has done, both for America and for Israel, and say, obnoxious or not, his policies have been wonderful for the state of Israel. He's moved the embassy to Jerusalem. He's recognized Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. He's been willing to say that Israeli settlements are not a violation of international law. And right now, there's the whole issue of his Trump peace plan, where he's giving $50 billion as an incentive to the Palestinians to come and negotiate an honest two-state solution. And in the meantime, he's saying, if they don't, Israel has now the green light to extend sovereignty over those parts of the West Bank, which everyone understands would be part of a two-state solution as Israel, if there ever were a two-state solution. So there are many American Jews who understand the criticisms of Donald Trump. At the same time, they feel there is an overwhelming burden of evidence that he's been good for the United States and good for Israel, and they believe American Jewry should be supporting him in greater percentages than the 20 to 30% that traditionally votes Republican. This is where we are as we end the month of July, and there are people who are also in the Jewish community, both Republicans and Democrats, who are upset with what they feel has been a weakening in democratic bipartisan support for the state of Israel. That they're upset with the anti-Semitic and anti-Israel statements of the Squad, AOC, Tlaib, and Omar. And they're also upset that there have been letters written from only Democratic members of Congress, both the Senate and the House, to either the Secretary of State or to the Prime Minister of Israel, objecting to administration policies that they believe would be better for the state of Israel. So the concern among some is that there's been a weakening of bipartisan support from within the Democratic Party, and none of the grown-ups in the Democratic Party, the Pelosi's, the Schumers, none of them have basically come down hard on those who are expressing anti-Israel statements. Even Joe Biden has been criticized by some in the Jewish community for saying he will restore payments to the Palestinian Authority, which will be used at least in part for the Pay for Slay program of the PA, which rewards terrorists who kill Israelis by giving stipends and pensions to them and their families. That's the context in which I want to hear the two of you discuss what you feel the strengths are of your respective candidates. And Halie, I want to begin with you. You've heard all the things that I've said. What do you want to say in general? Make any opening statement you want to Jews who are watching right now, who might even have been Democrats in the past, but who are edgy and uncomfortable about where the Democratic Party is now when it comes to Israel.
Well, thank you, Mark. And I'm glad you started by talking about the fact that the overwhelming majority of Jewish voters have been and will continue to support Democrats. If we look at the past 3 elections, we have seen a diminishing of Jewish support for one party, and that party is the Republican Party. 33% of Jewish voters supported Republicans in 2014. 24% of Jewish voters supported Donald Trump in 2016, and a mere 17% of Jewish voters supported Republicans in 2018. So since Donald Trump has been in office, there's actually been a diminishing of Jewish support for Republicans. And why is that? Well, Jewish voters are deeply concerned about the rise of white nationalism, the emboldening of white supremacy that we have seen emanating from this White House. In the past few weeks alone, the president has amplified calls for white power on Twitter. He has praised white nationalists. His ads were removed from Facebook because he used Nazi imagery. This week, he hired someone who has ties to a Hungarian Nazi party. Jews, 73% of us feel less secure than we did 2 years ago, and over half blame Donald Trump for the rise in insecurity. And let's face it, it's not just American Jews. Now that we face an unprecedented public health crisis, Americans also are blaming Donald Trump for our rising health insecurity. So Jewish voters have been Democrats because the Democratic Party aligns with our values on key issues that are of importance to Jews, whether it's domestic policy issues such as access to affordable health care and education, or foreign policy issues such as a strong U.S.-Israel relationship. I also agree with you that this relationship has been politicized, but it has been politicized by President Trump, who has personalized and politicized this relationship in recent years. Jewish voters face an easy choice in this election because with Joe Biden, we don't have to compromise our values on domestic policy issues, and there has never been a Democratic candidate for president with a longer, multi-decade, 4-decade record of support of Israel. You mentioned this issue of pay to slay. This is a law that's in place, the Taylor-Force Act, that of course Joe Biden would adhere to. The funds you're referring to are security funds that go to the Palestinian Authority to support security on Israel's border. And in fact, the Israeli government themselves wants those funds restored. When Donald Trump was told about this last year, he reportedly said, well, if Netanyahu wants that $12 million of funds for the Palestinians, he can pay for it himself. So Donald Trump has been long on symbolism, short on substance when it comes to Israel, and for that reason and many more, Jews will overwhelmingly support Joe Biden in November.
Thank you for that very wonderful opening statement, because it represents, again, what I hear many Jewish Democrats arguing, and you said it very, very well. Bruce, I want to take the things that Halie said one by one. She talks about the diminishing support within the Jewish community for a Republican candidate and argues that the support has dwindled even more under Donald Trump. Do you have anything to say about that?
Sure. Your formulation at the opening was exactly right. And by the way, I was listening to your opening and I thought you got everything nailed. I was wondering why you needed us. But you opened by talking about how there are 2 blocks of Jewish voters. And that's exactly right. That's exactly right. There is a larger mainstream block of voters in this country who happen to be Jewish. There's nothing Jewish about their politics. When asked about Jewish issues, for example, J Street, an amazing thing. J Street, group that claims to be pro-Israel, claims to be with the Jewish community. J Street conducts polls. J Street's own polls show that 4% of American Jews prioritize Israel when thinking about how to vote. There are key issues, which is astounding, by the way. Could you imagine Planned Parenthood bragging that only 4% of their members prioritize abortion, or the NRA saying that only 4% prioritize the Second Amendment? There are key issues that define the Jewish community, that determine whether or not there is a Jewish future in this country. And those are really Israel's future as a secure Jewish state, opposition to anti-Semitism, and support for the free exercise of religion. The people who vote along those lines really are Jewish voters. They really deserve to be Jewish voters, and they elevate those concerns above what you would expect people living in their zip codes, income levels, education levels to show. The second block.
Excuse me, that doesn't speak to Halie's point. She contends that there is diminishing support for Republicans and that fewer Jews voted for Trump than voted for, I guess, Romney. Is that true?
I was comparing the 2 midterm elections. So I went back to 2014.
Okay, and I'm asking then both of you. Because I don't know that that's true. I thought you were saying, Halie, that fewer Jews voted for Trump than voted for Romney. Are you
No,
saying that or not?
no, what I was looking at was the past 3
Okay,
elections.
so what you're saying is, so you do acknowledge more Jews voted for Trump than for Romney. I'm really surprised you would use the midterm election. I mean, Obama got killed in the midterm election. Clinton got killed. Presidents tend to get killed in the midterm election. The real question is, in the presidential election, my understanding was more Jews voted for Trump than voted for Romney, and that in fact, at the moment, there is more enthusiasm. There are Jewish Democrats, Halie, that tell me all the time, you know, I've been a Democrat my whole life. I'm not comfortable in the Democratic Party right now. And the reason is anti-Semitic things aren't being answered. I use the term grown-ups, by the grown-ups in the party. And I'm not a Republican. I don't want to be a Republican. I got nowhere to go. Halie, I hear that all the time. But we'll come back to you in one moment. Bruce, the next thing that Halie said was that Donald Trump is a white nationalist, that he supports white nationalism, that he praises white nationalism. What do you have to say about that?
It's pure garbage. It's lies. There's no basis to it. It is nonsense going on. Donald Trump has done more to combat anti-Semitism, has stood more strongly with the Jewish community, has stood for Jewish interests, far and above anything that we've seen before. Ami magazine, which is an Orthodox-oriented magazine, surveyed 753 readers last December. Asked them point blank, who do you trust to combat anti-Semitism? The choices were Donald Trump and the Republicans, 92.5%. Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats, 1.4%. The rest were undecided or no difference.
But I asked you about white nationalism. I didn't ask you about anti-Semitism.
It's entirely absurd. There is no white nationalism. Donald Trump has never done anything to forward white nationalism. He has repudiated white nationalism. He's repudiated white supremacy. He repudiates them 10 times. The Democrats say, why didn't he do it 12? He has repudiated these people from decades ago. He left the Reform Party in 2000 because there was anti-Semitism, because he believed that some of the guys were verging on white nationalism. He has a long track record of standing against white nationalism, and the fact that people have defamed him and lied and reported things that he never said, pulled out a half a sentence, talk about dog whistles. Donald Trump has never once endorsed white nationalism, period.
I wish that was true, Bruce, but that is patently false. Let's talk about the past year, because 2019, according to the Anti-Defamation League, we saw an unprecedented, shockingly high number of white nationalist propaganda throughout our country and of anti-Semitic violent incidents. And I know you two are in New York. New Yorkers have seen this. And it is not just from white nationalism, but certainly there has been a shocking rise. And I didn't call Donald Trump a white nationalist. What I said is that he has emboldened white nationalism in our country. There's no question about it.
You said he praised them. Has he
praised them.
When did he ever praise a white nationalist?
So 3 weeks ago on Twitter, there were those chanting white power. He retweeted it and called them great people. In April of this year, there were right-wing armed extremists who were protesting with swastikas who stormed Michigan's Capitol. He called them good people. He praised Henry Ford for good bloodlines. You can go back and continue to talk about all of his praising of right-wing extremists, and this has emboldened them.
Okay. By the way, Bruce, is Henry Ford a white nationalist?
Henry Ford was a white supremacist. Henry Ford was a Nazi sympathizer.
So how do you feel about Trump saying something nice about Henry Ford?
About his bloodlines.
I don't
see terminology.
I don't even know what it means to talk about somebody's bloodlines. If you want to say something nice about Henry Ford, he was a very important industrialist. This much is true. He was a bad person.
Isn't that all Trump meant? Trump wasn't talking about him as a person. He was talking about him in a business context. And I can understand why somebody would be upset, but I think it's a hair out of context. But Halie is making a specific charge, Bruce, that what Trump has done is facilitate the white nationalists in our country. I hear that all the time. What do you say?
It's absolutely wrong. What has facilitated, first of all, there are white nationalists in the country. There are a growing number of them. There is still no real organized white nationalist movement in this country. And that's an important distinction. The second thing is, what's emboldening the white nationalists, what's emboldening the rise in white supremacy is progressivism. It's all the people running around bashing white people. The best commercial I ever saw for white supremacism was some of these protest rallies going on last month, where they divided the crowd into white people and black people and said, white people, bow down to black people or wash their feet. If you wanted to advertise to promote white supremacism, you couldn't do any better. This is absolutely shocking. The only thing creating a white supremacism in this country.
I don't understand your point.
Identity politics.
Explain this to me. You are somehow legitimizing white violence because why?
No, I'm not legitimizing anything. All identity politics is illegitimate. The people who divide crowds into black people and white people are racist. The people who say white people should wash the feet of black people or black people should wash the feet of white people are racist. The people who say we have to divide the country, we have to think about people differently because they belong to different races, that's racist. Doesn't matter if they're black, doesn't matter if they're white. I'm not condoning any of it. It is all 100% wrong. But when you have a movement that plays forward every day saying white people are bad, white people are bad, white people are bad, some of those people are going to say, you know what, screw it, let's fight back. This is a necessary backlash. This was easily predictable.
Okay, it makes me uncomfortable that you would sound as if you are giving permission to white people to fight back in the context of the protests that were over the death of George Floyd.
No, I'm not giving anybody permission. What I'm saying is that when you put in place a racist movement like progressive identity politics that says we must divide the country into races and we must pit one race against the other, everybody is going to go to a camp. This is what progressive identity politics does.
Okay, I want to stick as much as I can specifically to the points that Halie made about Trump. I asked her about bipartisanship and that there are those American Jews who traditionally been Democrat or they're not Democrat. And they feel that there is a weakening of bipartisan support in the Democratic Party. And Haley's comment was Donald Trump personalized the bipartisanship. How do you feel about her argument?
It completely misses that Barack Obama entered office antagonistic towards Israel and grew more antagonistic while he was in office. He was the most rabidly anti-Israeli president we've seen since World War II. He entered office talking about putting in daylight between the U.S. and Israel. He gave Netanyahu a cold shoulder. He was hostile to Netanyahu. He left office labeling every Jew living in Judea and Samaria an international criminal. He put in place an Iran deal whose clear goal was to normalize Iran as a nuclear threshold state so people could open and do business there. Obama was strongly against Israel. He built up the anti-Israel bloc within the Democrat Party, and it's been growing since then. Donald Trump is pro-Israel. It is that simple. It was Obama who turned the Democrat Party into an anti-Israel party, and he didn't do it alone. I mean, he built on things that had been bubbling up there for quite a while.
Interesting, but a footnote just for you, Bruce.
Yeah.
Why do you call it the Democrat Party? It's the Democratic Party.
Are you sure?
1,000. Bruce,
I have
1,000%, and you can look it up. And every
I have looked at it.
Right to be
I have
they want to be called, and so it's interesting. I'm I'm somewhere in the middle here, but it just drives me crazy when people decide they're going to make a point and call it the Democrat Party. It's the Democratic Party. You don't like the name? Too bad. It's the Democratic Party.
I am inconsistent on that
It
point.
sounds to me, though, that when Haley makes the point that Trump has personalized the way in which the administration and the White House deals with Israel, I need a better answer. Does it bother you that he's personalized it? Has he personalized it?
He has not personalized it. He has pursued the best interest of the United States. He has far and away the best Middle East policy of any president we've seen since World War II. I mean, he opened his presidency, his first trip abroad. He gave a major speech in Riyadh, which was a wonderful speech to the collected Arab heads of state. Trump does like to personalize things. He likes to have personal relationships with people. That's part of his personality. It's part of who he is. Bill Clinton, I think, did similar things. Barack Obama, George W. Bush had different styles. But I mean, the idea that the Democrats should say, oh, well, you know, if Donald Trump likes Israel, we'll hate Israel. No. What should happen is, by all means, let there be a race to a top. Let the Democrats come out with things that are far more pro-Israel than anything the Republicans did. Then I'll go back to my Republican friends and say, can you top this? And I hope they will. And I hope the Democrats will top us back. Okay. I want a race to the top.
Okay. Haley, any response to Bruce's response to your saying it's personalized?
Well, what I actually said is that he's politicized and personalized this relationship, which has endured over 7 decades and must continue no matter who is in the White House or which party is in power in Congress or in the presidency. And we Democrats support bipartisan support of Israel. It was Obama who finalized, with Joe Biden by his side, the 10-year, $38 billion memorandum of understanding, which is an unprecedented security agreement between the United States and Israel, which Joe Biden will continue. And we now know that there's language in the Democratic platform for 2020, the draft platform, that supports that continuation of that agreement. That is Obama's legacy as it relates to Israel. I also disagree with the notion that Donald Trump has been so great for Israel. As I said, he's been long on symbolism and short on substance. And what do I mean by that? Well, look at his precipitous withdrawal from Syria of 1,000 U.S. troops in Syria in December of this year that led to the resignation of his Secretary of Defense because it wasn't in America's best national security interests. Well, guess who else was concerned about that? Israel's national security establishment, because it's left open a corridor on Israel's northern border that Iran has exploited from Tehran to the Mediterranean. So the consequences of Donald Trump's reckless foreign policy have not been good for the United States and have not been good for Israel.
Okay. I want to know from you the extent to which you either do or do not appreciate what is important to many pro-Israel Jews. And let's take them one by one. The move of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem for many, many American Jews, especially, again, pro-Israel Jews, was a tremendous statement that president after president has promised during election cycles and then never follow through on. What's your own feeling about the importance of Israel's moving its embassy to Jerusalem?
Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. And as Joe Biden has said, he would continue to have our embassy there. A sign was changed from one building to another. And that's important symbolically. But as I said, it's a symbolic gesture. And it is the capital. So it was the right move. And it's not one that will be reversed. But again, the security consequences of some of Donald Trump's reckless policy have been devastating for Israel's security.
What's your reaction to Trump saying in basically giving approval to Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights?
Well, nobody was questioning Israel's authority over the Golan at the time.
So it doesn't bother you.
The recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan was timed to come right before an Israeli election. So this speaks to the politicalization of this relationship. He was attempting to help Netanyahu with his election. Israelis have a right to go to the polls without the US president
By the way,
in one way or another.
Halie, you know this for a fact?
I'm giving our view as Jewish Democrats. I also take issue with a few things that that Bruce has said, and I want to go back to them.
I promise I'll let you, but I want to understand where you stand on the issues that are very upsetting to Jews, many of whom have been lifelong Democrats. How do you feel about Trump saying that the Israeli communities on the West Bank do not violate international law?
I think what matters to American Jews is our security, our safety, and our values. And when Bruce said there's nothing Jewish about our politics if you don't support Israel, Jews do support Israel. Over 90% of Jewish voters support Israel, and of course are opposed to the rise of anti-Semitism. The reason that I'm a Democrat is precisely because of my Jewish values. And I think it's extremely important that we continue to support candidates who share those values,
I understand,
including support of Israel, and that includes Joe Biden.
And again, you say that well, but I'm going to remind both of you, this is not Meet the Press. I asked you a specific question. How do you feel about the Trump administration saying that the Jewish communities on the West Bank do not violate international law?
The majority of Jewish voters support a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And certain things that this president have done, including giving a green light to unilateral annexation of the West Bank, are troubling for what it means to the US interests in the region, what it means to Israel's own security. And that is why the draft Democratic platform, which also will represent the views of Joe Biden, opposes unilateral measures by either side, including annexation. And importantly, it also opposes any efforts to delegitimize Israel, whether through the international global boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement or at the United Nations.
Okay. And by the way, it may be that I'm not asking the question correctly. I'm not talking right now about annexation. The move that was announced by Pompeo, Secretary of State Pompeo, which then evoked only from Democrats, 107 Democrats, sent a letter to the Secretary of State very upset about the fact that the Trump administration had said, we believe international law does not make Jewish communities on the West Bank, which is disputed territory, illegal. And that should be a yes or no for you. Either it
well, I'm giving my answer. The reason is because Democrats overwhelmingly support a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and are concerned about any measures, whether settlement expansion or Israeli annexation, that would impede prospects for two states in the future.
So what you're saying, I think, is by an administration saying that the communities on the West Bank do not violate international law, by that act, they are making the two-state solution less likely.
What I'm saying is that Jewish voters support a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the measures that this administration have taken have made securing two states harder.
Did the Trump administration make a mistake when it said that the settlements were not a violation of international law, or did they not make a mistake?
They made prospects for two states harder.
Was it a mistake?
That's my answer.
Okay, but you are understanding you're not answering whether it was a mistake or it was not a mistake. By the way, Bruce, was it a mistake?
Of course not.
Why of course not? Oh wait, Haley's point is, it may feel nice to Israel. It may feel nice to Israelis. It may feel like, to to American Jews who are pro-Israel. But her point is there are Democrats who feel that by doing this, you are making the two-state solution less likely and more difficult. That's the claim. What's your response?
Okay. First of all, when I say yes, obviously it was the right thing to do. It was the right thing to do. There were two things going on here. Pompeo's actual statement was a statement of law, and it was a correct reading of the law. Then there's the politics, and that's what Halie was addressing. She was addressing the politics of the matter. This notion about a two-state solution is a sleight of hand. Okay, what American Jews say that they support is two states living side by side in peace and security. That is, in fact, a two-state solution. It is not any two-state solution. Nothing happened. If the Arabs decide that they want to live side by side with Israel in peace and security, absolutely nothing that has happened has made that harder. In fact, the Trump plan, which came out after the Pompeo announcement, made it much easier. It laid out parameters, it laid out a timeline, it gave them 4 years to get their act together. To the extent that anybody on the Arab side wants two states living side by side in peace and security, that is more easily attainable now than it ever has been in the past. Now, if you ask most American Jews whether they would take two states, any two states, even if they were at war, two states bombing each other, I suspect that you would get very different answers. But there is a tremendous sleight of hand that goes on. The questions are always formulated in the best case scenario for two states, and then that's taken to don't do anything that'll make it more difficult to form a state. The bottom line is that everything the Trump administration has done works with facts on the ground, facts that have been developed, not theories. And moving towards reality, towards honesty, and towards resolving the conflict, which is what the Trump plan has done consistently, is the only way to help Israel and to help the Arabs living there. It is what is necessary for the region.
Okay. Halie, any response?
You know, I don't know that we're going to agree because I again thought that the Trump peace plan was failed from the beginning, and we saw that you know, even in the Arab states who initially agreed and then later the Arab League condemned it because it was clear that they weren't even totally clear about what was in it. I still to this day don't know what was in it. Bruce mentioned something about $50 billion for Palestinians. That money isn't real, it doesn't exist, they haven't seen it. So, you know, again, long on symbolism, short on substance.
Okay. I want to tell both of you what the argument is in general, and then I want each of you to have a chance to respond to it. The argument that the pro-Israel community makes is that as long as the United States gave the Palestinians the impression that the United States was going to force Israel into some kind of two-state solution that would in some way put their security in jeopardy. As long as the Palestinians felt they had the United States on their side, they were not going to be part of any two-state solution because their ultimate mantra, which I assume both of you know, is from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And at the moment, the Palestinian ideology is that all of what we call Eretz Yisrael really belongs to the Palestinians. And so it's very hard for them to give up any piece of land in a two-state solution, since they believe it's all theirs to begin with. But as long as the United States made it seem like they weren't going to take Israel's side, it emboldened the Palestinian. The argument is that Trump comes in and Trump says to the Palestinians, look, either you come to the table with the Israelis and you work out some kind of two-state solution, or the train will leave the station. And we're not going to prevent Israel from developing its own life, especially in areas where everyone agrees Israel will end up if there were a two-state solution. Trump is saying, if you're not going to come to the table, then why should we put a muzzle or a rein on the state of Israel? And so he moves the embassy and he validates the Golan Heights. And now he's saying to them, the settlements, the communities on the West Bank are not illegal. And you know what? Yeah, you go consider extending Israeli sovereignty over parts of the West Bank, which again, everybody understands are going to be part of the two-state solution in Israel if there ever is one. And that's the argument. The argument is that Trump, for all his sort of bumbling and whatever, a bottom line has been helpful to Israel because the Palestinians have been in a situation where they're not getting money anymore for pay for slave. And you know, Halie, it's all fungible money. It doesn't matter how the money is earmarked. If the United States begins paying money back,
that's solely to Donald Trump, but in fact,
any way they want. But
yeah, this started in the Obama administration, that there was a reduction in funds commensurate with the amount of money that they had were assessing was spent on family. And it continued under Congress. You can't solely attribute that. The passage of the Taylor Force Act was a bipartisan measure that passed in the House and the Senate. This was not Donald Trump's initiative. And it's one that Joe Biden would continue. Okay. It's something that's consistent with the measures that were taken in the Obama administration.
Okay. Anyway, how do the two of you react to this general argument that explains why Trump has been good for the state of Israel? And I always ask Halie go first. So I'm going to ask you, Bruce. You go first.
I mean, this is accurate. The Trump plan. I'm stunned to hear anybody say it's not substantive. It would suggest they didn't read it. The Trump plan addresses a huge number of important issues that have been left off the table. It is entirely grounded in reality, and it says, let's move forward. You know, it is not simply a matter of Israel and the Arabs. You cannot stabilize a region if you have two things. If you have disputed territory or large numbers of stateless or displaced people. Around the world, throughout history, those are guarantees of instability. Preserving the disputed territory has been a terrible thing. Looking at the Arab side, the PLO charter itself explains what's going on. The PLO charter says the Palestinians are an indivisible part of the great Arab nation. Right now, we have to cultivate the Palestinian identity to fight the Zionists. 1974, the PLO came up with a phase plan that said, wrest any piece of territory we can control and use that to launch a war against Israel. That's exactly what's been going on since Oslo. I think that today you can have an interesting debate as to whether or not the Oslo Accords were an idea worth trying or not, but they have been a total dismal failure. And what's more, we have gone far beyond what Israel envisioned during the Oslo Accords. Yitzhak Rabin, shortly before he was assassinated, talked about how he would never agree to an independent state of Palestine. I mean, the conversation, particularly during the Obama years, went so far off the rails that what Trump has done is brought it back to reality and said, let's move forward with the region. The Arab-Israeli conflict is resolvable. The Arabs are focusing on their own states more and more, which means they're dropping what was always an imperial claim to the entire Middle East. We're going to let Israel move forward. And yes, there are still displaced and stateless people that need to be addressed. In the Middle East right now, if you look at the entire Levant, it's probably about 20 million displaced people out of a total population of 80 million. And what we need to do with them is get them resettled in places where they are comfortable, where they're culturally at home, and we need to get money together to do that. That is what the Trump administration has been doing. It's been moving towards resolving the territorial dispute and moving towards giving decent lives in places that people are culturally comfortable, not solely for the Palestine refugees, to use the term from the UN, but for all the refugees in the Middle East.
Okay. Halie, your response.
We have never had a candidate on either side of the aisle, actually, that has a longer record on foreign policy as Joe Biden. He was first elected to the Senate in 1972, and for decades in the Senate, including as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and then as vice president, has been unwavering in his support of Israel. I recently watched a floor speech that he gave on the floor of the Senate in 1986, speaking out against the missiles that Ronald Reagan wanted to give to Saudi Arabia. His reason was because it would potentially jeopardize Israel's security. Joe Biden is a true friend of Israel. And Democrats, when we go to the polls, and Jewish voters, when we go to the polls, are going to be voting on a range of issues. And yes, Israel is important, but with Joe Biden, there's no compromise. But we're going to be voting on the crises in our country. Let us not forget that we've just surpassed 140 Americans who have died, in part due to the recklessness and catastrophic handling of this unprecedented health crisis that we all face. I can't walk out of my house without a mask or fearing for my health and security of that of my children. Let us not forget the situation our country is in. And we are also isolated. We are isolated because Donald Trump has damaged our alliances with other countries. He wants to pull us out of the World Health Organization, which is essential to finding a resolution to this crisis we're facing. So our isolation not only has potentially impacted our health, but also our security. And when America is weak, Israel and our allies are weak as well. So this presidency of Donald Trump, it has been a disaster for Americans, and yes, for Jewish Americans as well. And that is why Jews will overwhelmingly support Joe Biden in November.
Okay. By the way, our audience, you know, I am friends with both of these people. If I'm pushing them, I'm only pushing them intellectually. So, Halie, you understood my question. My question wasn't about, I was going to give you a chance to say everything you just said, but that was sort of like at the end. I asked both of you a question. Now you can say to me, Mark, I just don't want to answer. But the question posed to you was, there is an argument being made that the Trump philosophy, as it applies to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in which he says to the Palestinians, either you come to the table or we're not going to reign in Israel anymore. We're going to let them develop. That is a positive. And that whether you like Trump, you don't like Trump, whether Trump has been good on Corona or not good on Corona, that's not the question here. The question that
I thought this whole
Jewish
discussion is about the election. So
ask is, to what extent is the philosophy of Donald Trump, as it applies to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and saying to the Palestinians, we've had it. It's over now. We're not going to support a regime that says from the river to the sea. We're not going to support a regime that says if there's a two-state solution, it will be Yud and Rhine. And that's the argument that you will hear people who like Trump say. I just want to know if you have any reaction to it.
Sure. Donald Trump has said nothing to the Palestinians because he cut off diplomatic ties with the Palestinians years ago. He doesn't talk to the Palestinians. And that certainly is not a way to get both sides at the table and bring about a negotiated two-state solution. Donald Trump also doesn't have a philosophy. He doesn't have a doctrine. He doesn't have a foreign policy. There is no coherence. He makes phone calls like the one he made with the Turkish President Erdogan, and makes rash decisions such as withdrawing 1,000 U.S. troops on from Israel's northern border from Syria. So there's no philosophy behind this foreign policy. It's one of incoherence and recklessness that has been damaging to U.S. national security as well as Israel's interests.
Okay, Bruce. So Halie says incoherent and reckless. What do you say?
It's not remotely incoherent. His foreign policy makes a great deal of sense. Specifically, his Middle East policy makes a great deal of sense. Look, the Trump plan was a gift to the Arabs. It was a gift to the Arab states. The Arab states are tired of the monster they created. They created an artificial entity. The PLO was actually created by Nasser and the Soviet Union, and they've lost control of it. Right now, you've got the governments in the UAE, certainly, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Morocco. They want to develop relations with Israel, and they can't. They're hamstrung because they've given Mahmoud Abbas a veto on their foreign policy. They need a way out. They need a way out, and once they get their way out, the Arab-Israeli conflict will be over. Israel will exist as a Jewish state, as an exercise in self-determination, and the Arab states will go on as independent states, as strong sovereign states. Trump came into office in less than a year. By the end of 2017, he had a national security strategy out. It's a terrific strategy. It puts American interests first. It says we want strong allies around the world. We want them to be strong sovereigns. We want them to be proud of who they are. We want to work with them. We expect them to carry their weight. This is what's happened. He's gotten our NATO partners to pay more for their own defense, which is critical. Something that every president, including President Obama, spoke about. Nobody got serious about. President Trump got it accomplished. He has strong alliances. We have strong alliances around the globe. Now you look at the international organizations. The WHO sold out to China. If in fact there were an organization committed to world health, absolutely, I would want the United States to be in it. But just because it's called the World Health Organization doesn't mean it's doing good work towards world health. And this is the case with most of the United Nations agencies. If you read their charters, like the Soviet Constitution, they sound like wonderful organizations, but that's not what they do. The WHO and the Chinese Communist Party bear primary responsibility for this global pandemic. They handled it terribly when it could have been contained close to its source. And they did that intentionally. What President Trump has done is he's had good plans for dealing with this crisis, and he has been committed from day one to inflicting as little damage as possible on the American economy. The single most dangerous vector, the one vector that resulted in the most deaths in the United States, was when Andrew Cuomo sent COVID positive patients back into nursing homes. 45% of US deaths were in nursing homes. It's a smaller percentage in New York, but if you look at the numbers, there was no single action responsible for more deaths than that one. Again, people just keep telling stories. They're not true. What President Trump has done to confront the health crisis was he was the first one to put travel bans in place. He was widely criticized for it. Now everybody says, couldn't he have done it earlier? He engaged the private sector immediately. He got more masks made. He got more ventilators made. He worked up. It turns out there was a lot of important equipment that nobody could find. Cuomo, in fact, complained that he didn't have enough, then discovered that, in fact, he did. He just didn't know where they were. He got things around the country. He got extra hospitals to New York when we were in a crisis. Turns out we didn't need them. He has respected the federal structure by letting governors and mayors take the lead in doing what they're doing. And quite frankly, most of them have been doing a horrible job. But the bottom line is that everything Trump has done on foreign policy and on domestic policy is grounded in reality. And the reality is the US has to watch for its own interests first, everybody else is next, and that we have to get the economy up and running, and we have to work with strong sovereign allies.
Okay. And I said this to Halie, I'm going to say it to you. There was a specific charge that she made, and I was very anxious to hear how you would answer it, because there are many people, there are many Jews, by the way. I'm telling both of you this is the reality. There are many Jews who don't like Trump, but think what he does is good. And they're critical of him in many ways. And this includes Republican Jews who think he's been wonderful on Israel. They still think he's made a lot of mistakes. And what Halie said was, she used a very specific word, that she said Trump's foreign policy is incoherent. And then she gave an example She gave an example of a conversation he had with Erdogan and ends up taking troops off the Syrian border. This is not an isolated thing with Trump. With President Trump, there is a sense of we don't exactly know here at any point in time what his overall foreign policy is going to be. And obviously, Bruce, we've seen person after person in policy decisions leave Trump. And I don't want to make more of it than I think is real, but it's real enough to know that there are disagreements of policy. So when Halie says to you, is there a certain lack of what structure, and that both she and people who don't like Trump and people who do like Trump all can have a sense of what his foreign policy is going to be at any given time, that there's a doctrine, there's no Monroe Doctrine, Truman Doctrine. Is there some kind of doctrine that you think reflects what he is saying, which would answer in a sort of satisfactory way the charge that many people make that Trump is incoherent in his foreign policy?
Yeah, there is a structure. It's laid out in his national security strategy. And I will do something you don't hear Republicans do very often. Okay, I will address the withdrawal of the troops from Syria by way of criticizing Ronald Reagan. Okay? And during the Reagan administration, he wasn't a Republican, so I guess I can get away with that. Those 1,000 troops sitting in northern Syria were a tripwire. They were not enough to win a war. They were there until they got shot at. Now, probably, in my opinion, certainly the worst foreign policy move of the Reagan administration was sending Marines to Beirut, sticking them in a barracks, and giving them very limited rules of engagement. They were sitting there until they got blown up, which is exactly what happened, and then they went home. With 1,000 troops in Syria, you have two choices. Actually three. You can keep them there until somebody shoots at them, and then many of them end up dead. You can pull them home when you think that they're about to get shot at, or you can send orders of magnitude more in order to put in enough of a presence for us to fight. Those are the only three choices. Given those three choices, I was not pleased with what Trump did to the Kurds. And quite frankly, I don't think anybody has a good idea about how to handle Turkey, which is one of the most difficult problems right now. It's in our alliance structure, and it has not been acting like an ally for a long time. But yes, he had a call with Erdogan, and I believe that he left that call with Erdogan aware that his choices were pull those kids home or have them get shot up and create an international incident, which would necessarily result in our being in a war in Syria. I think that was what was going on there. As to the strategy, he said it straight out, and I repeated it before. We want to live in a world of strong, proud, independent sovereigns. We want to ally with them. Within that, we would like those sovereigns to treat their people decently. But this is essentially it. It is a matter of viewing the world as a group of nation states. Every nation state has its own culture. Every nation state has its own interests. Every nation state has its own allies. And we are building alliances, and we want our alliances to be alliances of equals. We don't want to babysit Europe. We want to partner with Europe. And that's what he's been pushing.
Okay. The Democratic platform still calls for a two-state solution. Will the Republican platform call for a two-state solution?
No, the Republican platform didn't call for a two-state solution in 2016. The Republican platform said we are opposed to pressuring Israel to do anything that it thinks is against its own interest. And it will continue with language along those lines.
Do you think the Democratic platform is wrong when it calls for a two-state solution?
Yes, that was why I worked to get it out of the Republican platform.
Okay.
A two-state solution.
How do you feel about the fact that the Democratic platform does call for a two-state solution, the Republican one is not?
A two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is really the only viable path forward that will result in two states for two people, including a Jewish and democratic state of Israel. And that is why it has been the policy of consecutive Republican and Democratic administrations going back to Clinton in the 90s. But I share Bruce's interest and concern about the safety and security of U.S. troops. I would note that the withdrawal from Syria did lead to the resignation of Defense Secretary Mattis because of that concern, and also that the Republican platform in 2016 that Bruce worked on with regard to Israel was also changed to remove some references to Ukraine that were viewed as a sleight of hand, something that was positive for the Russians. And when it comes to our troops, we have learned that Donald Trump knew about a Russian bounty on American troops' lives and heads in Afghanistan that is unconscionable and did nothing about it. So what we have seen from this president is not just a diminishing of our own interests, but also not looking out for our troops and consistently aligning with dictators such as Vladimir Putin. And even the Republican platform in 2016 reflected that by removing those references to Ukrainian sovereignty.
Okay. By the way, do you have any question about whether Donald Trump is or is not a Russian agent?
You know, you've used a lot of names here. You mentioned, is Donald Trump a white supremacist? Is he a Russian agent? What I would say is that Russia sees him as an ally. Racists see him as an ally. White nationalists believe they have a partner in the White House. So you see the behavior of all of those folks change over time. We have a crisis in our country of systemic racism. And that's why I proudly joined with those marching that Black Lives Matter in front of the White House just weeks ago. We have a crisis of the rise of white nationalism and white supremacy in this country. And yes, we have a crisis that going back to 2016, when Russia interfered in our elections and Donald Trump has done nothing about it. In fact, at every turn, he has sided with the Russian government as opposed to the interests of the United States. So I think it's important to note that, you know, I'm not going to categorize him as an agent, but Russia certainly sees him as an ally, racists see him as an ally, and white nationalists see him as an ally.
Any comment? Bruce?
Well, there's no evidence to support any of that. I don't know what white nationalists she's talking to. Putin certainly doesn't see him as an ally. He's been much tougher on Putin than either Obama or Bush.
Okay, stop for 1 second. By the way, Halie, there doesn't seem to be any question about that. That in terms of the sanctions that have been put on Russia, Trump was harder than any president has ever been. So I'm also surprised that is, you know, just it's in the air all the time, that Trump loves Putin.
Well, let's look back at the Helsinki summit when he stood by him and when asked by reporters about Russia's unprecedented interference, which remember our 17 intelligence services unanimously said occurred in January of 2017 in a large unclassified report, Donald Trump said, well, Putin said he didn't do it. And he has blocked efforts in Congress to strengthen our elections to ensure that it doesn't happen again, because he saw it as a threat to the legitimacy of his election in 2016. Okay. So there are many examples to point to.
My understanding is, and I may be historically incorrect, you correct me, but my history is that in 2015, people came to Barack Obama and said to Barack Obama, you know, Russia is going to interfere in the 2016 election. And Barack Obama basically did nothing about it, wasn't concerned. And in fact, when he was asked if Russia could influence the election, he went to the Rose Garden and said, this is basically silly. It's silly. And we all know that it was Barack Obama whispering to Medvedev about he should give a message to Putin that once he wins a second term, then he can be more cooperative with Russia. And my point is not that Obama was a Russian agent. My point is that that somehow politics are so ugly, they make the argument without telling the whole story, and they're willing to just cut little slices that seem to serve their needs.
No, the whole story of the 2016 election is in the
both of you are able to talk about the larger picture. And maybe it's not, maybe it's silly of me to think that, but for you to say that Trump didn't try to stop the 2000, he wasn't president.
I actually didn't say that.
2016.
What I said
Barack Obama was, and he chose. Obama chose to do nothing.
Mark, I didn't say that. What I said is, in January of 2017, the US intelligence community, all the agencies came together and unanimously released a report that talked about Russia's unprecedented interference in our elections. And in the 3+ years since, Republicans, including Donald Trump, have blocked efforts to ensure that it does not happen again. Even today, there is an argument about whether we should strengthen our election infrastructure to ensure that this does not happen again. In addition, there are numerous instances where Donald Trump has sided with the interests of the Russian government over those of the US.
Outside of this silliness about when he was in Russia, standing next to Putin, and the whole Russian thing has been so debunked, and it's such an embarrassment to people who take this seriously. But what other, again, in terms of policy, Trump has been harder on harder on Russia than any other president. And nobody ever says that, Halie. If someone votes for Trump, Halie, are they a bad person?
Absolutely not. Unlike what Bruce said earlier about, Democrats, nothing Jewish about their politics, whatever he had said about, I don't cast those kind of judgments. I'm expressing the view of why I am supporting Democrats, and that is because of my Jewish values and my support of Israel.
Good for you. All right, Bruce, any response to what Halie has said here?
Well, first, let me agree with her. This is a battle for the soul of the country. If you care about the Constitution, you must vote for Donald Trump. It doesn't matter whether you like Donald Trump personally. It doesn't even matter whether you think he's done a good job. If you care about the Constitution, you vote for Trump. A vote for Joe Biden is a vote for mob rule. We have seen it.
Why?
We've seen in 2018, there were two groups of new Democratic freshmen coming in. There were radicals, many of whom were anti-Semitic, running in safe seats, and there were moderates running in suburban districts. The question was who would control the party. I didn't think it was a tough call, but it hadn't happened yet. Well, we know the radicals are controlling the party. Right now, we have mobs taking over our cities. We have Democratic mayors emptying the jails. In New York City, we got rid of bail. We are hamstringing our police. We have people who want to take away our guns. We have a Speaker of the House, when asked specifically about people toppling statues, shrugged it off as people going to do what they're going to do, which, by the way, they are. But, when you are, quote unquote, the adult in the room, you might have something to say about it. What we are watching happening in this country is absolutely abominable. And it is all happening in Democratic-run cities and states. And the Democratic leadership is not speaking out against it. What's more, we've got anti-Semites, radical anti-Semites in Congress, and the Democratic leadership and the JDCA is not supporting their primary opponents. Now, I'm not asking them to back Republicans. Okay? Both Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib have Democratic primary opponents with credible backing, with impeccable progressive credentials. They're not people I like. They're not people I would support, but they are not anti-Semites. And neither the Democratic leadership nor the democratic Jewish organizations have been going out and supporting those primary opponents. It is absolutely appalling what's going on. The Democratic Party has become a dangerous radical party that believes in mob rule, that promotes anti-Semitism, promotes anti-Semites. It is now working on mainstreaming Louis Farrakhan, who most Jews recognize as one of the deadliest and most important anti-Semites in the country today. Violent crime is through the roof, and New York City's mayor is patting himself on the back for it. If you care about the Constitution, you care about personal safety, you care about the future of Jewish life in this country, you care about fighting anti-Semitism, you care about preserving the freedom of religion, you care about a secure Israel, you must vote for Donald Trump. If you like the mob, Biden's your guy.
And by the way, Halie made a comment about Black Lives Matter, and I think she said she marched with them. What's your sense of Black Lives Matter? And there are those in the Jewish community who are claiming that the problem with Black Lives Matter, and that in principle, of course, Black Lives Matter, but as a movement, the problem with the movement is it has serious anti-Semitic, anti-Israel overtones. What's your sense?
So Black Lives Matter is two things. It is a wonderful slogan, and it is a terrible organization. It's actually a networked organization. The slogan is completely unobjectionable. All lives matter, and if you want to focus on problems plaguing the Black community, go ahead and use the slogan Black Lives Matter. It is effective. It does not mean that non-Black lives don't matter any more than people supporting the police who say blue lives matter mean to imply that if you're not a cop, your life doesn't matter. It is a fine slogan, and I think that people who want to look at the problems plaguing the Black community in this country should use it. And from there, they should look to strengthen the family, which is in terrible shape of the Black community. They should promote school choice to promote educational opportunities. They should create jobs in those communities, all of which are things President Trump has been trying to do. Now, there is also a network of organizations that use the name Black Lives Matter, or alternatively, the Movement for Black Lives. They have a platform. It used to be readily available online. Now you have to do a little digging, but you can still find it. It's an explicitly Marxist organization. It stands against the nuclear family. It accuses Israel of genocide. It is rabidly anti-Semitic, and it draws its primary influences from the Nation of Islam and the Black Panthers. So what I say to people is, if you want to promote the welfare of America's Black communities, and I think you should, and I do, focus on reinvigorating the Black family, the Black churches, creating jobs, securing the streets in those neighborhoods, keeping people safe, and getting them educational opportunities via vouchers. That's a real agenda to promote Black lives. Stay away from Marxist organizations. Their goal is to bring down the United States, and they say so.
Halie, any comment you want to make in response?
Sure. So JDCA has spoken out against those with whom we disagree, those who don't share our values on a range of issues, including Israel and anti-Semitism. And that list includes some members of Congress, such as Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, some other incumbents who we spoke out against even before they were elected. And we will not be supporting their re-election. We've also spoken out very strongly against Louis Farrakhan. And importantly, we've also spoken out very strongly against the President of the United States, who has the strongest microphone in the country and therefore is quite dangerous when he repeats anti-Semitic generalizations and says things that are emboldening those who have targeted us at our synagogues in the unprecedented horrific attacks we saw in Pittsburgh and Poway in recent years. So there's no question that anti-Semitism in all its forms must be condemned, and I encourage the Republicans and the Republican Jewish Coalition specifically to condemn the anti-Semitism emanating from this White House.
It has been so wonderful to talk to the two of you. And I said to the audience already, it's one thing for us to go at each other during a discussion of this type, but off camera or off microphone, I think the two of you are both lovely, and you're very principled. And I hope the audience senses that what each of you want from your own perspective is the best for America and for the Jewish community. And people may agree or disagree with any part of what one of you said, and I'm not fooling myself. The reality of life is such that very few people are swayed by a discussion like this. It usually is either entertainment or they turn it off. But every now and then, somebody hears something that makes them think in a different way. And I hope that the people who have been watching, our JBS viewers, appreciate you, because that's what you were both trying to do. You were both trying to say something that might help somebody, change their mind just a little bit or become more sure of what they wanted to do. And so, Halie and Bruce, it is so lovely for you to have, again, given me this much time. And the election is not yet here. So I may chase you one more time to see, especially as things move on, whether issues crystallize more during the campaign as we get closer and closer to November. But I thank both of you. I wish you both kol tuva hatzlacha, success in all of your personal endeavors, whatever they are. And I also hope both of you and your families stay safe and healthy. And, one day we'll all come out of this coronavirus together and have a chance to be together, either in studio or having dinner somewhere. But thank you very, very much. All the best to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
The thoughts of Halie Soifer, Executive Director of the Jewish Democratic Council of America, and Bruce Abramson, who's a longtime Republican Jewish activist who's worked on the Israel plank of the 2016 Republican platform. And I do hope you found the discussion interesting and enlightening. Of course, I'd love to hear any comments you may have to any of the arguments made by Halie Soifer or by Bruce Abramson. Please email me at rabbigolub@jbstv.org or write me at Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Special thanks to the producers of this edition of Election 2020, Tisha Bader and Alan Oirich. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Stay safe and be well, my friends.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.